Hello there, it's your boy Sunnyfung here. Hopefully you're all doing good. It's been a long time since I last uploaded a video onto YouTube due to personal circumstances such as work, the global silicon chip shortage that's occurred in the past 2 years, as well as, other things like, for example, my streaming, etc., where I play games, etc. If you want to have a look, twitch.tv/Sunnyfung. But on a serious note though, I'm doing a video which I have intended to do for a long time. I built a computer for a friend of mine, in the Cooler Master NR200P case with several components, from previous projects, etc. And I thought I'd make a video about, the build process. But yeah, it's been a long time coming, but yeah, I won't keep you guys for too long. Let's just get straight to it. Let's start off with component selection, and where better to start than at the heart of the computer, the CPU. Here we have an Intel Core i7-9700K, which has got 8 cores and 8 threads. This CPU may be a few generations old, but it is more than capable of handling gaming loads, since most gaming loads are GPU heavy. Next to that, we have got the motherboard. This is the ASRock Z390 Phantom Gaming-ITX/AC, and this particular motherboard is known to be the motherboard with the best power delivery when it comes to ITX motherboards that support the Z390 chipset. It should have no issues with the processor that we've chosen. Then we have our RAM, a set of Crucial Ballistics RAM, 2x16 gig kit, 3200 MHz CL16 rating, more than enough for gaming scenarios. Below that, we have got the Sabrent Rockets 1TB NVMe SSD. This is the PCI-E Gen 3 version, but it doesn't really matter because the 9th gen platform from Intel doesn't support Gen 4, it only supports up to Gen 3. Then, above that, we have got our CPU cooler. This is the NZXT Kraken X63. It is a 280mm AIO liquid cooler, and it's going to be fitted to the side of the case. So, next to that, we have got the case, which all our components are going to be housed in. This is a Cooler Master NR200P. We are not going to be using the tempered glass side panel, which comes with a P because we need it for the AIO. Below that, we have got the Corsair SF750 SFX power supply. This little beast is going to be needed for powering our components because of this component, which is the Gigabyte GeForce RTX 3080 Ti Gaming OC 12GB. This graphics card has a recommended power supply rating of 750 watts, and that is why we have chosen the power supply we have chosen. For gaming, this is going to be absolutely excessive, but it is great. Below that, we have got a set of fans. We have got a pair of Arctic P12 PWM Slim PST fans for GPU intake. Then we've also got a pair of P12 PWM PSTs for top exhaust. And we've got a pair of P14 PWM fans, which are going to be using a radiator. And we also have a fan controller from NZXT, which we will be using to enable software control of the case fans. To start off with, let's install the CPU. To do this, push down the socket's retention arm and move it to the side to release it. Lift up the socket's cover and place the CPU into the socket, ensuring that the golden triangle on the CPU matches the triangle on the socket. After that, close the CPU socket's cover and slip it under the retaining bolt and replace the retention arm. Next, to install the memory. Ensure that the RAM module is oriented correctly before installing. To do this, check that the notches at the bottom of the RAM modules are lined up with the corresponding notches in the RAM slot. Open any retaining clips in the RAM slot and insert the RAM module. Push down firmly on both ends and you will hear 2 clicks. If you don't hear 2 clicks, you should feel 2 clicks as the retaining mechanism holds the RAM stick from both sides. Repeat the same steps for the second stick. Onto the SSD. We need to install the SSD in here, so we need to remove the heatsink, which involves removing 2 screws, and then you need to take the heatsink off. Be careful of the thermal pad that is underneath it. After that, I removed the screw for the SSD, which should be included in your box, and now we need to line up the 2 notches, one on the SSD, one on the slot, and then you insert the SSD at a 45-degree angle into the slot, after which you need to push down the SSD and screw it in place with the M.2 screw. Then replace the heatsink with the screws provided. Now for the CPU cooler backplate to be installed. First, we need to place this behind the motherboard socket, ensuring that the backplate pegs line up with the holes around the socket. Then we need to install the threaded standoffs into the backplate. This will be needed as part of the installation for the CPU cooler. Next, take off the side fan bracket from the case. Remove 2 screws at the back and take this bracket off. We'll need this for later on. Turn the case over to the back and you'll see there are 2 screws which are holding the power supply brackets down. remove those screws and then remove the bracket itself in order to extract the power supply brackets from the case. Next, we need to look at the installation of the power supply. There are 4 holes on the power supply bracket, 1 in each corner, which will line up with the corresponding threaded holes on the power supply unit itself. Insert the power supply into the bracket. I have the fan facing this way to draw in fresh air through the side panel, and then use the 4 supplied screws from the case in order to secure the power supply to the bracket itself. Now, to install the power supply, you need to line up the 2 hooks from the power supply bracket and slot them into the 2 slots that are in the case itself. Once these are hooked in, secure with 2 screws at the bottom. To install the motherboard, you need to install the I/O shield first. This gets pushed into the back of the case, and then the motherboard goes in next. Line up the I/O with the I/O shield, as well as the 4 holes on the motherboard to the motherboard standoffs in the case. Next, use the supplied screws from your case to secure the motherboard to the case itself, making sure not to tighten the screws too tightly. Connect the internal extension lead to the power supply unit. For power, we need to connect an 8-pin CPU power cable. We need a 24-pin ATX motherboard power cable. We also need 2 8-pin PCI Express power connectors for the graphics card, but I've got a single cable as this is a daisy chain cable. This will help reduce some cable clutter. And then last but not least, we need SATA power for powering up the AIO and the fan controller inside. Now we need the 8-pin EPS power connector. This will likely be marked CPU on the power cable and connected to the top left of the motherboard. We then need to tidy these cables up a little bit and move these out of the way, for we need to now get the 24-pin power connector and connect this to the right hand side of the motherboard. Now we need to tidy these cables as well, so you kind of just shove them in between the motherboard and the power supply, and then there are some Velcro tie-down straps on the power supply bracket, so use those and move the cables as out of the way as possible in this case. Now we move on to the front panel audio. This connects to the bottom left of this particular motherboard. We have a USB 2.0 internal header splitter, which we will explain about later on, and we also have the front panel connectors which go in the bottom right of this particular motherboard. And we've got the most annoying front panel connector possible, which is the internal USB 3.0 connector, which has to go into the right hand side of the motherboard below the 24-pin power connector. As you can see, it's a bit of a handful to actually get put in there, but then once you do some cable management, it looks a lot nicer. Here we have 2 slim Arctic fans and the bottom of the case. Remove the fan filter from the bottom of the case, and then with the fans oriented for intake, have the holes lined up with the slots in the bottom of the case. Now tap each of the screws into the fan mounting holes. Don't go all the way through, and then do it for both fans, and you can then adjust the position of the fans, secure it as you wish, and then reapply the filter. Secure the bottom panel, thread your fan cables through the case, slot the front lip of the bottom panel through the chassis, and then press down firmly to engage 2 clips. Following that, screw the bottom panel in place at the rear. Now we move on to our CPU cooler, which is the Kraken X63 from NZXT. As you can see, the copper baseplate is clean, and we need to mount it onto this bracket from the case. When attaching the bracket to the AIO, make sure that the tubes are on the same side as the flanged end of the bracket, and line up the screw holes from the radiator with the slots on the bracket, and then secure to the bracket with the 8 provided mounting screws from the AIO liquid cooler. In a similar fashion, we have got the fans. These need to be secured using the screws provided with the AIO, with the fans oriented for intake. Before we can look to mount the CPU cooler onto the CPU, we need to first apply thermal paste. I've got Cryonaut here, and I like to use the X method, though any method is fine. With this AIO, there are 2 cables to connect to the pump block. The first one is an internal micro USB cable, and the second one is an NZXT proprietary breakout cable. Now, mate the AIO cold plate with the CPU itself. To secure the AIO, we need to use 4 thumb screws and use these in a cross method around the CPU mounting bracket to ensure an even distribution of pressure, and then I like to use a screwdriver to make sure that the mounting pressure is as good as possible. Next, we connect the SATA power cable from the all-in-one liquid cooler to the SATA power connector from the power supply, tied the cables up, and then also the internal USB connector for the all-in-one liquid cooler, which connects to the internal USB splitter, and then tied the cables up further. After this, peel off the protective film on the pump block of the AIO. As you can see in this particular case, I did not have the most cleanest of peels, but it is what it is. I did need to clean it up a little bit afterwards. The next item is the NZXT RGB and fan controller with 3 PWM fan headers, 2 RGB connectors on the back, and it requires SATA power and USB 2.0 internal connection, which is why I needed an internal USB 2.0 splitter. Attach the fan controller to the front of the case using the included strips, and then connect the SATA power connectors, as well as the internal USB 2.0 connection to the splitter at the back. And next, you just need to tidy up the cables a little bit more prior to the next step. We then move on to connecting the bottom fans. So this uses a PST technology, which allows you to share the signals for up to 5 fans. So daisy chains 2 of the fans together and connects it to the fan controller. Well, I kind of disconnected and reconnected to tidy up some cables, put it through the case rather than for front, and then tidy cables up again. Next, to install the graphics card, the RTX 3080 Ti, remove 2 screws from the back of the case, which are used for retaining PCI-E cards and adding cards. Then we need to try and install the oh, never mind, it's too big to go in the side. Oh yes, it has to go in through the gap at the front. So, slowly insert your graphics card through the hole in the front of the case and work its way in through the case. Once you've managed to patiently get it through, it should fit in nicely. You push it down into the PCI-E slots and secure with 2 retaining screws at the back. Following this, use the daisy chain power cable that you had left behind from earlier on and use that to connect the power cables to the graphics card. There is your first one and there's your second one. Then you can just try and push the cables down to tidy it up a little bit more. Before mounting the radiator bracket to the case, I'm going to connect a fan splitter to the fan hub. This will be clear in a few moments once we get there. Here it is. There's the radiator. Right, there are 2 fan cables coming from the fans. Pull those through the front of the case, and you'll see the flange on the bracket goes into the front of the chassis. Now we need to secure the rear of the bracket with 2 screws. With the radiator bracket secured, we can now connect the fans to the fan splitter. Make sure one of these fans is connected to the header with 4 pins from the splitter, and then we can tidy the cables up by shoving them into the hole and hide them. Now for the top fans, we have got fan grills which have got pegs that go through them. These pegs go through the fans themselves and stick out on the other side. Do this for both fans and then you're kind of ready. This is going to mount to the top of the chassis, where there are 8 holes that line up with this, and it's as simple as just pushing the fans in with the pegs in, because the pegs secure themselves onto the top of the chassis. The fans we got here are the PST version, so you can daisy chain fan connections once more. Nice and simple. To mount the top panel, first of all, we need to get the fan cables through inside the case and probably out the front, so that we can connect this to the fan controller later on. But then we need to line up everything else. So line up the front panel connections with that of the top panel and secure. There should be 4 pegs, 1 in each corner, and then screw the top panel in from the back at the top. For the top fans, connect the remaining fan connector to the remaining fan header on the fan controller, and then shove the cables into the case to tidy things up a little bit more. To close the case up with the side panels, you got the flange which goes over the side of the bottom edge, and then you push up at the top where 2 pegs hold it in place. And then for the front panel, it is a matter of 4 pegs, 1 in each corner, securing the front panel in place. And that is this decent build in an NR200P. Now that the system is built, how does it look? Well, with regards to the CPU and the GPU, so the Intel Core i7-9700K and the Gigabyte GeForce RTX 3080 Ti Gaming OC, performance numbers are not something I'm going to provide, because you can probably go on the internet and find a ton of reviews, be it on YouTube or other internet outlets that will have that information. In terms of this specific system though, with an ambient temperature of 23.1 degrees Celsius, after leaving the system to steady state after 20 minutes, the CPU reached 30 degrees Celsius and the GPU reached 35 degrees Celsius. We are looking pretty good so far, I think, all things considered, bearing in mind that the fans on the bottom, the side, and the top of the case are being controlled via the NZXT CAM software, and there are custom fan curves involved in that. With regards to stress testing, I ran Prime 95 small FFT to stress the CPU, and Firmark with 1080p resolution and 8x MSAA to stress the GPU. With an ambient of 23.1 degrees Celsius, the CPU maxed out at 78 degrees Celsius, and then the GPU maxed out at 71 degrees Celsius, which I think, speaks for itself. The case is very, very capable in terms of its cooling abilities. I also did further tests later on with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where with an ambience of 23.8 degrees Celsius, I ran this at 4K, highest preset, MSAA 4 times with no RTX. The CPU and the GPU, so CPU is running around about 63, 64 degrees Celsius, with the GPU running around about 72 degrees Celsius. So we are in that ballpark in terms of the GPU side of things. Obviously, the CPU is probably being stressed less. So in terms of, the case, it was a great build. It performs as I had hoped. There are some recommendations for those who want to consider building in that particular case, the Cooler Master NR200P. The biggest consideration, I would say, is you'd probably want to use some sort of fan controller, software-based enabled, so maybe something like an NZXT RGB fan controller like I used, or, in my next build, or even in the build that I have behind that, yeah, you won't be able to see it. I've got another NR200P there. I have a Corsair Commander Pro. Corsair Commander Pro is probably a better option because it does allow for the splitting of internal USB headers. So it means that you can then obviously connect to Commander Pro and also connect your all-in-one liquid cooler to that as well, because most ITX boards only do come with one internal USB 2.0 header. Other considerations to have are, if you're getting a liquid cooler, make sure you do check clearances to make sure that they fit. It was quite a tight fit in terms of the radiator into the brackets, but it just about fit. You won't be able to fit radiators on the top because of the spacing at the top with regards to the fans. If you do use an SFX power supply, then bear in mind that it will take a bit more space, which then restricts the fan mount at the top, which means you might only be able to use a single top exhaust fan. But yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. It was a nice build. The video was a long time coming. I do apologize about the delay on this one. Soon, hopefully, I will have a video on something called a Steam Deck. I'm intending on taking it apart and doing some thermal testing with various thermal interface materials to see how much of a difference it makes. But yeah, on a serious note though, for those who, enjoyed the video, do give this a like, and also, give me a subscribe. If you do want to ask me any questions, etc., best thing to do is to pop by on my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/sunnyphone. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, and yeah, take care of yourself. I'll catch you in the next one.